Okay, hi everybody. It's great to be here for the first City Forum event of the 22-23 academic year. And it's really great to be here for the first live City Forum event in over 2 years, I think. Today we're going to discuss the results of about a almost 1.5 year research project between CRP faculty, students, and collaborators at the City of Austin. This project is sort of summarized in this recently released report, Expanding Pathways to Quality Jobs in Austin's Growing Green Economy, and you can get and read or download the full report, and I hope some people do it. I hope some people are interested. Again, this report involved collaborations between Dr. Catherine Liebernick, Miriam Solis, myself, but also 3 important student collaborators, Haijing Liu, Tony Basiri, and Kayleen McHugh. Is Kayleen here? Anyway, big hand for them because they were really important contributors. This research program really benefited greatly as well from students in the practicum supervised by Dr. Solis last fall and spring, and especially a really innovative work they did on the Photo Voice project. So this was really a big joint collaboration between CRP faculty and students. And we also have our great collaborators from the city, Luan Tucker, who you can't see right now because she's on Zoom. You'll see her soon. And Mark Coder. Luan's the manager of the Austin Civilian Conservation Corps of the City of Austin, a really interesting and innovative program in the green job space that's located in the Parks and Rec Department of the City of Austin. Mark Coder, who many of you probably know, he's been a long-term friend of CRP and teaches CRP and so on and so forth. He's the Climate Resilience and Adaptation Program Manager of the City of Austin. And Daniel Collada, who is the Interim Chief Innovation Officer of the City of Austin. They do some really cool stuff like accelerators and incubators for kind of green businesses and so on and so forth. So we really thank you all for taking the time to come today. In terms of choreography, I'm going to kind of start off and talk about kind of green job definitions and green job estimates. Catherine Liebernick, unfortunately, came down ill this morning, so she won't be here. I'm going to kind of just kind of go over some areas of work that relate to linking city policies to kind of community level adoption of green policies and getting benefits from green policies and green jobs. Miriam is here, and she'll go second. She's really going to focus on workforce development links, and then we're going to get comments from each of our 3 city collaborators. Okay, so let's start big. Why as a nation have we been had a poor or mediocre record at addressing our environmental challenges? Well, for as long as most of us can remember, proposals for more aggressive environmental actions have met with this perennial lament that stronger environmental actions will make everything more expensive and it'll kill jobs. You hear this every time there's a debate at any level of government about these environmental actions. Stronger we're not going to really deal with the make everything expensive argument. I mean, environmental actions make some things cheaper and some things more expensive, and the things they make more expensive may be essentially internalizing externalities, but But we're really going to focus on this, or kind of take on this idea that strong environmental policies kill jobs. And to take on this argument, we really have to think through and be able to communicate the amount of employment and economic activity supported by environmental policies and efforts to improve environmental outcomes. So one reason this argument is kind of persistent is that the jobs and economic activity affected by environmental policies, particularly climate related, in terms of the kind of basic fossil, they're very legible. We all know and can see who works in fossil fuel related industries. It's mining and extraction, it's distribution, it's the fossil fuel component of the electric power industry. Estimates of these sectors range between about 950 and 1 million jobs, but those jobs are very regionally concentrated in a relatively limited number of states. And there's a very high concentration of white male workers in these industries and occupations associated with conventional fossil fuel industry. So to address this, and environmental industries, we know, we can think off the top of our minds about some of them, but not all of them. And to address this problem, we really strive at the opening of the report and the beginning of our research to define green jobs and green economic activity. And we use an estimating technique actually pioneered by some European scholars led by Francisco Vonya and various co-authors and collaborators. Because we know, these are green activities and green jobs, but what about manufacturing workers who are making a conventional toilet versus a low-flow toilet, or a manufacturer who's producing very contemporary, energy-efficient HVAC systems versus not, or what about people in the bicycle production or bicycle repair? Are those green jobs? So to get at this, we use these techniques. We first define green jobs as jobs that essentially directly produce goods or services that improve environmental outcomes, or involve changes in production processes that improve environmental outcomes. Then again, using this technique pioneered by Vonya and so on, we use this Bureau of Labor Statistics ONET system, which is this occupational data system. And they have within ONET a green economy program. And the green economy program at ONET goes to the very detailed occupational level and breaks out all the tasks associated with that occupation and distinguishes between tasks within that occupation that improve environmental outcomes and tasks that have zero effect on environmental outcomes. We use this technique to quantify essentially the work time in each occupation given to green tasks versus non-green tasks. So I'm not going to nerd out on the methods, but basically this is from the Green Economy Project, and they go through very, very detailed tasks associated with each occupation, in this case roofers, and the ones in green they classify as green tasks. And so the method's a little more complex and involves weightings and so on and so forth, but basically we say, well, how many green tasks over the total tasks in the occupation? 0.3 in this particular case. We multiply that 0.3 times total employment in the roofer occupation to come up with an employment figure. It's a little more complicated than that, but that's basically the idea. So using this technique, we first estimated national employment, green employment, from 2010 to 2018, and then a BLS projection to 2028. And as you can see here, green jobs increased from about 4 to 5.8 million, much bigger than the fossil fuel industry, the figures that we looked before. And as a share of total employment, the green job component is growing. So it's growing faster than the economy. So this is a growth sector. We did the same for Austin. And Austin A has more green jobs as a share of total jobs than the national aggregate, and is growing robustly from about 3.3% of total employment in 2010 to 4.18 in 2019. So this is definitely, in kind of prima facie terms, an economic development growth opportunity. Now, using this technique, which I just described, a number of occupation activities that in the literature are thought of as green are sort of left out. So that estimate I just showed you is a very kind of conservative, restricted estimate. We added in occupations like public transit operators, because public transit generally improves environmental outcomes versus cars. We added, zoologists and biologists. We added some occupations. We came up with what we called an expanded estimate, which is in the report. And in this estimate, obviously, the green economy is significantly larger as a share of total employment and is also growing robustly. Now, the underlying goal of this report was to try to identify a set of occupations that would be providing very strong opportunities for family supporting jobs, particularly for residents of Austin that have traditionally not had access to green jobs or the green economy, or had poor access to the labor market in general. So to do this, we projected for Austin job growth by occupation, and it's a long story, but you can only do that using Texas Workforce Commission data. So this is just for Travis County, whereas those prior numbers were for the entire MSA. So for Travis County, green job growth projected from 2018 to 2028 is robust, 33,000 or 4.2% of total employment in 19 to 4.25% by 2028. Now, all of these projections that I've just run through do not account for recent policy changes like the infrastructure bill, or I don't know what, I can't remember, it's the Inflation Reduction Now bill or whatever it's called, which makes significant federal investments. Although at the local level, it doesn't account, for example, the opening of the Tesla plant, which arguably is 4,000 or 5,000 workers who would be classified as largely green workers. Anyway, so these are all fairly conservative estimates. But what we wanted to know is what were the most promising job opportunities in terms of job growth over the next 7 or 8 years, and particularly growth that had wages that were good and offer kind of career building opportunities. So the majority of occupations locally are in Travis County that showed green job growth tended to require higher levels of educational attainment, 14 to 15 years plus as an average. And as you see here, these are kind of business management and service, which is kind of surprising, but you'd be surprised how green some of these management occupations are. So managers, all others, for example, this figure here is management, all others, mostly kind of sustainability officers at companies and corporations and so on and so forth. So there's lots of opportunities there. And these annual job openings are the annual jobs that will be available year by year, every year in these occupations. So they account for quits, et cetera, et cetera. So lots of new job openings annually over this period in this area. Somehow my thing is... Okay. So we were really interested in occupations that did not require higher levels of educational attainment, didn't require a higher ed degree. So these are occupations that pay over $20 an hour and that are accessible for someone with a school degree, typically with perhaps some training. And these are, kind of concentrated in certain kind of manufacturing services and in the skilled trades like electricians and plumbers and pipe fitters and water and wastewater treatment operators and so on. So these are the kind of occupations that we kind of homed in on. And then, as we'll talk about in just a sec, we're trying to really identify links between the workforce development system and these occupations, which provided family supporting, career building jobs. Then we kind of, in the last part of the report, we kind of focused on these 5 domains and looked at local policies in these 5 domains, the occupations in each domain that showed job growth with good wages, and then current in Austin workforce development links to these growing occupations in these 5 domains. So for workforce development, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Solis, who's going to talk about that dimension of the report.
I think I'm good. Hi, everyone. So I'm Miriam Solis. I'm part of the Community and Regional Planning Program. I'm not teaching this semester, so I haven't had a chance to meet a lot of our new students, but I will be back on campus next semester, where I'm really looking forward to digging more into this stuff with you all via courses and your individual projects. So I was very fortunate, as Michael said, to work with a large group of students via our environmental justice practicum. All 11 students were very engaged in building out the qualitative component of this course via interviews and a photo voice project that I'll briefly describe. One of the important theoretical orientations, I would say not just for this qualitative component, but for the project as a whole, is environmental justice. From the onset, the city was very committed to building out this perspective, this analytical approach into the project. And we were all, I think, very consistent about getting back to how are historically marginalized communities going to benefit from green jobs projections, and how can we collectively be more intentional about rethinking efforts and strategies to pursue that. And I think a lot of the times when we think about environmental justice theory, we think of environmental burdens. I think that's one of the things that most quickly comes to mind, because environmental justice movements have been, and importantly so effective at speaking to the harms that they experience at urban environments. But I want to point out that there's actually historically been a very strong connection between workforce, between labor, and environmental justice. So much so that in 1991, when leaders from local and national environmental justice movements came together in Washington, D.C. for the first, one of their first summits, they identified 17 principles of environmental justice. And one of those had to do with jobs specifically, but there's a lot in there. When you look at the text closely, there's a lot in there about economics and economic development. And what we know now is, through the work of climate justice movements, is that they've been very clear. We cannot have the equitable pursuit of green jobs. We cannot have a just transition if we don't rethink certain parts of the economy. So that's a theoretical orientation that the students I worked with took, that we try to keep coming back to. And I want to encourage all you, if you haven't engaged these principles, to reference them in their work, because you'll be surprised to find how they intersect with a lot of different domains of urban planning work. And so one of the ways in which local grassroots organizations, local community-based organizations do their work and try to create improved material conditions for historically marginalized communities is through workforce development organizations. These are organizational ecosystems that exist in all metropolitan areas, be it San Francisco, New York, here in Austin. And a lot of that organizational ecosystem is shaped by federal policy. So there are infusions of funds. Here in Austin, we have an example of a very prominent workforce development organization that's actually the legacy of interfaith organizing. We had folks locally in the 80s and 90s, I believe, who came together to create an organization to create jobs for historically marginalized communities. We interviewed 14 organizations. We included economic development organizations in that. And we interviewed them to understand what was going on the green jobs front. What is the strength of the connection of these particular efforts and green jobs? And we found some very important things. I should note that practicum students were involved in interviewing these organizations. At least one student interviewed one organization. So we all gathered this data and we all analyzed it. And what we found is that these programs are very diverse in their composition. There are short-term programs, there are intermediate-term programs, and they all understand, or they all adopt a lot of what we know about key workforce development strategy, which is it's so important to provide a wide range of services to ensure the success of workers during their program participation and afterwards. Where we did find a lack of connection or a disconnect is that only 3 of these programs were explicitly working in the area of green job growth. And we're trying to be intentional about building out that part of their repertoire. One of the other insights from this work is that only about 1/3 of these organizations are intentional about building in racial equity into their programming. That didn't mean, however, that most programs didn't recruit historically marginalized communities in other ways. For example, some try to recruit people who are formerly incarcerated, people who do not speak English. So the explicitness or lack of explicitness of racial equity, I think, presented an interesting nuance in our findings. And when it comes to the broader workforce development landscape, one of the recommendations we make is for there to be, certainly to continue that work of including and reaching out to people who might otherwise be excluded from labor markets, but to continue to build out what this means for people of color in particular, particularly as we see the disproportionate impacts of increases to the cost of living in Austin. So one of the other major qualitative components of this work, it was a very close look, I would say it's a case study, of the City of Austin's very own green workforce development program. And I'm actually going to stop for a second and ask, I'm supposed to describe this, but we actually have the ACCC leader here joining us. So Lawan, would you mind, I'm assuming you're there. We can't see you.
Hey, I'm here. I'm here.
Would you, can you give like a description of the ACCC, high-level description, and then we can build upon your remarks with the ACCC findings?
Yeah, so the Austin Civilian Conservation Corps is a workforce development program that was started in the legacy of the Civilian Conservation Corps. Are y'all able to hear me? I see some adjustments happening.
Oh, you can see us.
We got you. If you click that down arrow on your end,
gotcha.
on the Zoom, it should pop up. There you go. You could.
Yeah, you good?
You can expand
There
it.
we go.
There you go.
Yes. Oh, yes.
I see myself on the big screen. Good to see-ish, everybody. Okay, the Austin Civilian Conservation Corps is a workforce development program that was started through a multi-departmental, multi-community effort during the COVID-19 pandemic. As its name suggests, it was started in the legacy of the Conservation Corps from the 1930 era Conservation Corps. And the program started to be able to help Austinites and to really galvanize Austinites back to work in shovel-ready projects. But as many of the staff know, that the Civilian Conservation Corps was steeped in systemic racism. We have, at the City of Austin, we're fortunate that we have an Office of Equity and a climate equity plan that was in the final stages of being completed and adopted. So when this opportunity came up, I think most partners, all of us stopped and said, are we gonna really reboot a systemically racist program that on the outset was one of the first programs, workforce programs, that said explicitly it will not discriminate for race, but we know that they had segregated camps. So when we're thinking about rebooting programs and looking at the future green jobs, we really had to take a strong pause to figure out how we ground it in racial equity, because we can have as many green jobs as possible, but in my opinion, we will not see any change in climate and unless we ground it in justice and racial justice particularly. So we selected projects and partners specifically that we thought were making strides around workforce development and equity hand in hand, so that we can have a community that's learning together to pilot ways in which we can really ground any workforce development or any green initiatives in racial equity and be critical about who's benefiting from the programs and what communities they serve. And so the photo voice component was really critical, in my opinion, to highlight, and I mean, this study is important in so many ways. It gives us projections of where we should be investing and what those jobs look like, but it's also, there are people behind all these numbers and people behind all these jobs. Black and brown people really have made up some of the lowest paid jobs that have built this country for centuries, right? And so when we're looking at workforce development, we need to be critical about what we're paying people and what quality jobs that build wealth for families really look like. And so photo voice allowed us, and Miriam, I'll let you describe the tenets of it, but allowed us to really grab and learn from the voices of people who are actually in the jobs, working in the conservation field under our program, to hear about the pain points, the success, the joy, and things that we can improve on and learn from and magnify. And so it was a critical component for us to actually put people at the center of the discussion, in addition to the projections of what we'd like to see as we build an equitable community. So anything else, Miriam, that you wanted me to kind of touch on from there?
No, although I don't think I need to continue. You were you covered so much ground, but I will, just for the sake of going through these slides. Thank you so much, Lawan. I totally put you on the spot. And Lawan and her team engaged very meaningfully with our research team. And so I think that that's one of the reasons we ended up being able to not only do it, but generate insights that we think are going to be generative and hopefully helpful for the long term. So what do I need? Do I need to?
Just minimize, I think.
Okay. Oh, there we go.
And then you can click the
Oh,
arrow.
I see. Okay, so again, the City of Austin, this program was very new, and the City of Austin was very interested in reflecting on where it was at to continue to think about where it might go in coming years. So we conducted interviews. We interviewed Lawan, all sorts of city officials, their collaborators. We did photo voice workshops with 11 Austin Civilian Conservation Corps participants. One of those workshops took place here at the School of Architecture, and you could see some of those members here. And these questions were collectively identified. We had like 5 different drafts of these questions, and we kept changing them because we wanted to be accurate about what kind of information would be helpful to the city. And let me, I think I'm at time, so I'll run through it quickly. So one of the things we found is overall, overwhelmingly, I would say, the participants were so positive about their experience. And two things I think that our research team was really taken by. They expressed a great love for land and their relationship to the environment. And they expressed a lot of admiration and affection for each other. The camaraderie that exists in this program is unlike, I think, what we see in most workplace settings. And the finding about their relationship to the environment isn't necessarily new. A lot of research is finding that Gen Z has a very different disposition to the environment. They're thinking about it very differently. They want to have a different relationship to animals, to land. And we see that in the kind of people that ACCC is recruiting. Every single one of them wanted to pursue a green job or a job with green tasks, green job occupations after the program, every single one of them. Where there was a lot more uncertainty, ambiguity, and where we believe the ACCC can do great things is in what happens after their program participation. There was very little specificity in where the ACCC participants were going to end up after the program. They had a sense of the kinds of jobs that they wanted to do, but there wasn't a job lined up or a particular sector or a relationship that had already been established. And we know from workforce development literature that the most effective workforce development jobs are going to have a particular educational or skills building or apprenticeship opportunity lined up after that program participation. So I believe it was Michael who developed this diagram to identify stronger paths that the city can create, can design in order to ensure the ACCC participants continue to have good jobs and potential career pathways after their program participation. So I'll stop there.
Okay, real quickly, I'm going to try to pinch hit for Catherine. And I think it's important just to sort of describe what we think is a fairly innovative proposal. We really hope we'll keep bugging the city, but to keep sort of pushing it. And it really relates to making access to green benefits and access to green jobs more inclusive and more equitable, which is, kind of central goal or objective of this study. So the idea that Catherine and the team really came up with, the basic idea is that the city and or potentially other institutions should employ community members, in particular communities, to do two things. One, to really communicate with people, in a certain sense, market to the communities on a basis of trust, opportunities for environmental improvements that all the community members could access. For example, weatherization, and this is to actually go through all of the little steps and which program area, et cetera, to access, just requires a lot of bandwidth for anybody. And many members in all communities, but many members in communities is they're not exactly aware of it. They don't exactly know how to do it. They don't know what the financial implications are. Can they get other financial support, and so on and so forth. So there's all these barriers. So you find adoption rates of conservation measures or zero, whatever, all of the kind of green residential activity, adoption rates are much lower in lower income communities. So the idea, which wasn't our original idea, or the kind of spark of the idea came from City of Austin's Climate Equity Plan. FYI, students who have not looked at the Climate Equity Plan should investigate it because it's a very, very well thought out, sophisticated, and kind of inspiring document. So I would encourage people to look at that. But to put together the Climate Equity Plan, they created these climate ambassadors, and they were paid to facilitate discussions and interviews, and they engaged communities and so on and so forth. So from this, it seemed like a potential next step, which wouldn't be that expensive, and we think could be very effective kind of modeled off Go Austin, Vamos Austin's Climate Navigator program. So we urge that the city think about structuring a program where you hire local residents to advise the city about how to increase and improve accessibility, not just to possibilities for greener residential infrastructure, but also for jobs. Really get the word out and mobilize communities to take part of it, and kind of be on the watch as a neighborhood or community to really identify environmental challenges that emerge and that may be emerging in that community, like flooding or any kind of waste problems and so on and so forth. So we think this is a really innovative idea that we again hope can actually be pursued to really embed community members in their communities to again allow people in communities to access environmental benefits provided by city initiatives, and also link to the green job areas that we identify in the report. So with that, I'm going to turn it over. I'm going to try to bring Luan back up. There she is. And so I think I'd like to ask the city, perhaps beginning with Luan, who's on the screen, to kind of make comments about the report, make comments about maybe kind of where we go from here, or issues or challenges encountered in the city, and kind of moving forward with the kind of green activity, green jobs initiatives. So Luan, you want to make some additional comments on the?
Yeah, I think I'd also like to recognize, I think Daniel and Mark, y'all are there. I'm sure I can't see you, but Mark and Daniel were really instrumental in kind of getting this whole thing started. Daniel was the project manager prior to me, and so really I just want to recognize that as well. But I think some of the major takeaways that the city can learn is, one, you have to listen to the workforce, and there are innovative ways to do that. And creating plans about workforce in isolation without the people who the plans are about does not work and is disconnected. I think the other thing we're learning is that this is a growing industry, and we have to be critical about who is able to participate so that we don't exacerbate inequities of the past. And I think particularly the city can look at its own workforce, and this is something that we've been very vocal about over and over and over again, and that we intend to continue to push internally, is there are ways in which the city can link up with ACCC, with other workforce development initiatives and programs that are community-based, to make sure our workforce in the green space, but also beyond, is really reflective of the communities that we say we serve. And so I think this report helps us really push against our own internal structures to be very critical about how we're defining racial equity, and particularly in the sustainability, innovation, and green space that our careers are sort of in. I am frequently the only person of color in a lot of these conversations, and I often ask myself why. And so I think really examining these systems, examining who we elevate into roles of leadership is really, and what makes a job just. One of the things that we just saw in this latest council is we had to change our minimum wage, right? $15 is not a living wage for anybody in the city of Austin. It hasn't been for a long time. And so a lot of the conversations we've been having internally with ACCC have been around, if you're trying to target communities of color, communities who have low income and who have been traditionally systemically excluded, except through their own organizing efforts from the environmental justice movement and from gaining environmental justice, then you have to pay people a wage that is able to them to participate. Because otherwise what we're doing is really creating a program that's like recreational participation. Like if you can afford $15 an hour, then you can participate. And that's not at all what we're interested in building. Another key thing that I think we need to look at is the collegiate connection with our internship programs. And so as much as we've all in this room and myself have invested in the academic institutions, they're not always very accessible, definitely not equally accessible to communities who have traditionally been left out of the green space. And so when we look at internships that serve as transitional pathways into careers and transitional pathways into networks that can really transform your career, being connected to a collegiate institution shouldn't be the only way in which you can connect to that internship opportunity. ACCC has made some efforts to sort of circumnavigate that process by direct hiring. But I think it's time for us to really look at our system as a whole, all of the city, and really look at how accessible a lot of our jobs are, and look at how accessible a lot of our entry pathways are into a lot of these jobs to gain exposure for folks who've been traditionally left out of a lot of institutions that aren't accessible still to this day. So those are some takeaways. I'll turn it over to Mark or Daniel as well if y'all want to come in.
Do you want to talk about the council resolution and why we hired these guys?
So, hey everybody. So I'll do a little setup of how we got around to this report in the first place and why it mattered so much. So when this resolution was passed, it was during COVID. We were doing lots of different COVID response programs at that time, and the way those programs were working was some council member would come up with a good idea, write a page on it, and then throw it over the wall to the city organization. As y'all probably know, we have a council manager form of city, which means council's kind of our board of directors, and then creates policy for the city, and the city organization actually carries it out. Most of these things don't have a lot of detail behind them, and definitely don't have any money. So they tossed it over to us, and they said, Daniel, figure out how to make a conservation corps. Which we had actually done a Equitable Green Jobs grant program a couple years beforehand. So we, immediately there was lots of people that should have had obvious involvement in the city, sustainability, Parks and Recreation Department, watershed protection, resource recovery, tons of others, economic development. We all kind of got together and said, what are we going to do? And what we started, and what LaJuan touched on a bit, was we found a lot of programs that we could basically extend or that were ready to go, work that we needed to do, work that maybe had some money behind it, but just didn't have any path forward for basically the people to do it, the bandwidth to do it, et cetera. So the great thing about that is we had a big variety. That was one of our tenets, aside from creating more equitable access to green jobs, was that it wasn't just one type of green job, and that we didn't pigeonhole green jobs. That's why it was really important for us to work on that definition in this report. We didn't want it to just be solar panels, basically. So we did have a lot of different types of work, everywhere from public art to green construction, landscape management and restoration, and others. Things that were ready to go. Quickly got about 100 opportunities for residents paid opportunities for residents to be involved, which is great. Once we got this stabilized a bit and understood that the program had legs, we took a step back and looked and said, we have these opportunities. We don't really know what people want from a program like this. We don't really know in what directions we should develop this program in general. And we don't really know who all the partners and opportunities are that we can work with both during this program and afterwards. So this was kind of the innovation space for us. So what we did there is we did actually 2 additional projects, community-based projects with organizations that went deep into the lived experience of people that could benefit from these programs, that would want to go to these types of programs, that didn't have access to these type of programs, and understand what they wanted and needed out of a program like this, both for themselves and for their neighborhoods and for Austin in general. And that set up a ton of policy for us that LaJuan's been able to continue to develop into a really strong equity-focused program. For where should we develop in general, we had no idea what the green jobs economic landscape was in Austin, frankly. I mean, we could guess, we didn't know. So that's why we did this, to better understand that. And then as far as who we work with and getting more opportunities for people to go to from the Conservation Corps after they finished, we're doing an accelerator program to help build up organizations that can provide green jobs in Austin and create more of that landscape. So this was an integral part of that kind of trifecta, if you can think about it. And it's been really important. I think Mark will touch on it more, but even in this last budget cycle, which was very recently, Councilmember Alter was holding up this report basically justifying permanent positions for the Conservation Corps, which is something that we got, that Lawan's got now, and that's a huge deal. That means it's not going anywhere, right? Because we have been doing this off of ARPA money, off of these other big but one-time funding things, and we were looking at about like 2024 is when we had money through, but now we have it permanently established in the budget. And this report was a major, I don't know if I told you that. Yeah, Alter was, she was waving it around a few times, and yeah, so all that was really, this played a key portion of that. Also, the climate equity plan. So we've really tried to understand how we can put these things together to move these larger initiatives forward. This wasn't just a one-off. So that's kind of how that came around. Over to Mark. You can go whatever you want.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll back up a little bit and talk a little bit about the climate equity plan, but also about just equity in government in general, because this all sort of gets back to this bubbling conversation that's happening within the city. In city government, you need basically two actors. You need somebody to throw the ball and somebody to catch the ball. There are plenty of council resolutions that have been passed and just died. And there are plenty of great ideas that we've had, we tried to build up, and they're just died because of no funding or no support. And you sort of need those two things to happen, to align for things to actually happen. Traditionally, in the sustainability world, because I'm with the Office of Sustainability, we've always talked about these 3 E's, right? The environment, the economy, and the equity. We've always focused on environment, maybe a little bit of economics, and never really touched on equity. It's only been in the past 6 or 7 years that there's been this greater discussion nationally with all of these cities, sustainability offices, equity offices, innovation office, that we realize that the route to sort of social injustice, environmental injustice, all these topics are all the same root of colonialization. So when we originally did our climate plan 7 years ago, it was very much focused just on technical pieces. And I would say green jobs have been the same way. They've always been focused on like solar panels and green manufacturing. But over the past 7 years, things have really shifted, and we've sort of thought, what are we trying to get to? And if we were to do another plan, another equity plan, or sorry, another climate plan without considering equity, we would just be perpetuating racism throughout this process. But for a lot of people, greenhouse gas emissions and equity are like 2 very different things. So we started by working with the community. We're about 120 community members working through this process of what does that mean. And every time we talk about electric vehicles, sustainable buildings, natural systems, consumption, or transportation land use, jobs always came up. They came up in different forms. We would talk about, because I led the transportation land use section, talk about, hey, let's talk about mobility. Well, who are you going to pay to provide feedback? Who are you going to pay to drive the buses? Who are you going to pay to do all the things? And that's when we realized that green jobs, entrepreneurship, workforce development has to be these cross sort of sectional discussions. And why in the plan we don't have a separate group for workforce development, we actually have an overarching workforce development piece to it. So when we were about to pass it and COVID hit and it got delayed because of, was it being recorded? Because of state gas discussions. We finally passed it, but we realized like this ACCC piece was such a big piece of it. So when council passed a resolution, they handed off to Daniel. Daniel was freaking out. He reached out to everybody else. We all sort of chipped in and helped out, but we had no idea what we were doing. Which is why after like 6 months or 12 months of getting all this together, we reached out to Kathy Limernick, Planning Texas 2050, and then hooked up with these guys. The nice thing is that when the university does it, a little bit of a plausible deniability. Like if they find things that we don't want to talk about politically, we could be like, well, they did it. It's not us. But also, like, it allows us to get real, right? We don't have to have these political blinders on. It allows us to really have these discussions, that are looking at real data and real people. So all this work has helped us sort of really think about how we can change our own systems, but also how we can work with partners to change their systems as well.
Yeah, it was a pretty good cover actually to, I feel like the whole Conservation Corps program in general, to delve into how we do workforce development, because that's always been assigned to the Economic Development Department, and if what they effectively do is they have a contract contracts where they contract out all the city's workforce development. That's kind of as deep as we've considered it, right, as a city. And this allowed us to really rethink that in a way that was separate, totally almost, from the Economic Development Department. Not saying they were doing a bad job, but we were able to start from scratch, almost another universe, and center equity, think about what types of jobs, what type of pathways we would create if we weren't beholden to these contracts per se. So that was a really interesting thing that we were able to do as well. I mean, I know they do studies with UT, but they probably wouldn't have done anything like this, and so that was another really good opportunity that we got through this work and through this this research project specifically, rethinking how we approach it in general.
Yeah, I think there's green jobs. When I heard that, I hate that term. I hate that term because it's to assume that a job is not great unless it's even green, it's even better job. Like, it's just, the whole thing just does not sit well with me. And I was like, hey, let's just focus on jobs. Let's just get people jobs, get them employed, get them in the pathway to better employment. And then even internally, like Lawan mentioned it, when council passed a resolution, also was Conservation Corps, they thought green jobs were people who are outside maintaining land, right? Cutting down trees, and I'm like, it's 110 degrees outside. We should not be sending people outside. So early on, all three of us got together, and Madeline Morgan, the fourth, we're like, we can't just keep on talking about this as a green jobs or a landscaping job. This has to be about sort of next step, getting people certifications, getting people more money, and getting people better jobs. And it's really hard to fight the perception of Austin Civilian Conservation Corps or the perception of green jobs. And that's what this report does well. It sort of lays it all out in both technical and personal ways.
Yeah. Just to ask, and this, we kind of cover this in the report, and I guess as outsiders, we were trying to kind of tweak, but historically, the City of Austin has an economic development department. They always have. It's kind of changed over the years. But workforce development has never really been a prominent part of economic development of the city. And you mentioned, Daniel, that you were maybe trying to structure this kind of parallel. Or is there a way to get the city EDD and kind of existing core workforce stuff to kind of shift and become kind of, I wouldn't say more serious, but kind of really more sophisticated, looking at the whole kind of career pathways kind of approach to workforce?
Yeah, I'm hoping this is what the Conservation Corps work in general can help to do, because if we can create that alternate reality, let's say, and it's working, and it's robust, then it's very easy for them to start moving more in that direction. Lawan, we're doing work on this now, like right now, today, but do you want to talk a little bit more about maybe the relationship with EDD and workforce development, and kind of what our plans are, or what we hope our plans are?
Yeah, one of the things we talked about, and I know through this report, we've seen some of the disconnection in like who is just doing what in what space, who are the major workforce providers, and in my opinion, the most important part is like, and how are they doing workforce? Who's actually benefiting? What are the jobs next step? Sort of like what we mentioned before and what Mark alluded to, which is it's great if everybody likes their job. It's great if people feel positive aspects of the environment are contained in their work. But at the end of the day, our goal is to get folks into permanent or better employment with higher paying wages that help transition people into better, financial situations. And so our goal is to really have a study or network analysis that kind of looks at the major workforce who's at the table, I think, for the first time in genuinely to talk about workforce development in a way that's a bit different than their traditional model of sort of outsourcing workforce development to major providers. And again, I don't think it's necessarily a hard critique on how they're doing things. It's just another way to do things that focus on equity. And I just want to be clear, when we talk about racial equity, we're talking about, when race is no longer the single predictor of your life outcomes. And how do we measure that? Are we measuring that in our current workforce contracts? No, we're measuring mostly who's coming through them, maybe how much they're making next. But if we really examine who's benefiting from it and are the jobs that they're getting actually better off and sustainable, I think those are the bigger questions that our program will hopefully be, as we continue to grow, poised to help model. And then, of course, we always want, if our model is working and it's more connected to the needs of community that we're hearing, then hopefully it'll be contagious enough to spread to the way we do workforce, period. And I think that the model that we've taken, we've been open about ways in which things can be done differently. I think this report, I call it academic activism is the way I like to phrase it. It's like, we can all say things internally to the city and have all the critiques in the world and be told no over and over and over again. But it is different when you have an academic institution who's also on the outside going to council saying this is actually more important. This is more important than you may be hearing. And similar to what Daniel said, or Mark, this was used to justify real substantive resources coming to the department to make it less of a pilot program and more of a permanent program. And so I think the other, the recommendations in the report and photo voice as a component of the report, we're hoping to analyze with these full-time positions and with PDD and other partners to say this is the way we should be doing it. This is what we've heard from community members. This is what we should be paying people. This is how we need to push. And luckily, some of that is already happening. But I think it's going to take sustainable effort over time to really convince large-scale change in how we do workforce.
Maybe we should open it up to some, do you have anything to add, or?
I want to hear from you.
Okay, yeah, why don't we open it up for questions from the crowd?
I have a question and also just like some praise. So I'm Gabby Benitez. I'm a master's student in community and regional planning, and just am very, I think it's like really amazing to like hear all this work at the top level, but just like, Luan, all the praise to you for your work that you've done, and to ACCC, because I've just seen and worked with like at least some of the youth that y'all have worked with, and just seeing how, these organizations have literally carried these youth along with them as they are growing up. And it's just like, like sustaining people that otherwise may not be able to stick around in this city. So just like so grateful, and I really have to say that. And it's really exciting to hear that UT has been able to support this work like as kind of an external push on the city end. I think my question, or one of my questions, is thinking about, so I do work in terms of thinking about the barriers that especially youth, BIPOC youth, marginalized youth face when it comes to getting work in green careers. And I appreciated the definition that y'all shared too. Sorry, I'm totally rambling. But my question, I guess, thinking about, this difference between the top level jobs and then these entry level jobs, and I know you've already been talking about this a little bit, but I suppose I would love to hear more about what do you think could be done or what needs to be done, thinking about, these jobs that have, I'm just thinking about like what's the difference between, those 5 years of entry work and those 10 years you need in order to get that top level job, or if you have someone who doesn't have a degree, right? Like, how do you make it possible to skip that gap? And is there work kind of coming from that level too, or do you see, kind of top level folks also pushing for a reduction in barriers to employment? I don't know if that question makes any sense, but.
Yeah, I mean, it's a,
Yeah.
oh, sorry, go ahead, Luan.
No, great question. Go ahead.
I was just going to say it's a great question, and I certainly don't have the answer, but it's something that we've seen a lot. We've done kind of development and accelerator type programs, incubator programs in additional areas, homelessness and other types of social services, and it's a consistent problem. There are programs, like you just said, that prepare people to a certain level, and then the next level that they may need to be at is further than they're prepared to be. So Lawan mentioned a couple times, I think everyone has this idea of pathways, and that's been a key component of this program and this work for a long time, which is trying to work more to build pathways and steps throughout a career. So from day one, your first go around at this or something new that you're doing, to basically as far as you want to go. And that might be a job in some places, and maybe training in some places, maybe different types of education in some places. But we have problems with these gaps, right? So we're looking at that in different ways. Number one, again, trying to develop more and different types of organizations and businesses in Austin and in general that have more types of opportunities, right? Because the more types of opportunities you have, the more chance you have to advance. And then, Lawan, I'd love for you to talk about this, but a huge thing that I think has been developed is this pathway through the city, because the city is one of the biggest employers in Austin, and also by far one of the biggest employers that has the most types of these green jobs, or a lot of types of green jobs. So we ourselves could be a pathway, and we weren't a very good one. So Lawan, I'd love you to talk more about what we're doing there.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's multiple layers to that question that we are examining all in real time. So there's the question within the city, like, do you actually need a 4-year degree to do this job? Is there education in lieu? And also, does that education in lieu actually put you at a lower pay rate? And so examining how we zone people and how we take real life experience and lived experience and the expertise that people bring outside of the academic institutions. I think that's one layer of it that has to be done ecosystem-wide within the city of Austin. That is being pushed, I think, from middle level to ground level staff who are looking at their paychecks and wondering what's going on. So I think there's a lot of questions that are happening at multiple levels. The other part to that is, like Daniel said, there are a lot of really great pieces, and I think Miriam's work and the students' work with really talking to workforce providers, there's a lot of great work already being done, but there really isn't a connecting force to make sure that if someone starts in one pathway, they can transition to a certificate program. Right? So there's building the robustness into our program, but it's also our relationship as part of a larger workforce ecosystem and really focusing on that relationship, because the city can't hire anybody, although what Daniel said is accurate, or hire everyone. But what Daniel said is accurate. We are a major workforce provider, and so examining our role as an equity-based workforce provider, I think, is critical and where we can see a lot of change. So we've added internal pathways this year that did exist last year when the report was completed, building on the work of the cadet program that myself and Kirsten Johansson, who's the coordinator over the programs, and taking a lot of the workforce development pieces that were not connected before to create a pathway that was more connected with green stormwater infrastructure. We have land management, forestry, and I think the other part of your question that I heard is like there's also a divide, and the reports show this too, is like when I observe the workforce that is doing the majority of the grunt manual labor, often it's brown and black bodies doing the most work for the least amount of money. We have to examine that trend and say, why does this exist? And not just accept it as is. Part of that is the bifurcation or divide of education and accessibility to it. But the other part of that is, I think, looking critically at the internal structure, white supremacy structure that exists within the city that makes it difficult to really examine these systems and try to really understand why do we have certain racial components in different pay levels. Is it really about education, or are we seeing the larger trend that we're seeing in society is like our workforce and how we think about workforce has to dramatically change, and we have to be honest about that. So I think there's multiple levels of change happening, both at the larger level, but there's also, I think, we've hired internally folks who've gone through workforce development to give us the wisdom of what not to do. And we pay them to do that, as opposed to creating in isolation just what we think will work for people. So I think it's also who you hire, what you do, how you pay them, but it's also the power that you give people to make sure that these systems aren't just recreating, systemic racism. So I hope that answers the question.
Hey, my name is Vicky. I'm a master's in the CRP program. And my question was, has doing this work highlighted maybe any disconnects in how our workforce or like economic structure in Austin is set up? For example, like maybe these businesses who are participating are more in the managerial track versus we need a lot more HVAC technicians in the city, and no companies of that sort agreed to get involved. Have any kind of issues like that come up, and what are the plans to address them, like moving forward?
Do we have any major discrepancies like that? I can't remember.
Well, I mean, it's a good question. It's a little complicated. I mean, in the skilled trades, like HVAC technician, which is pretty decent salary and has a little bit of career ladder in it, there's a huge demand, and from the point of employers for people in that field. Then there's a training belt, transmission belt into that trade, but recruiting students into that trade is hard. In generally, the skilled trades are very hard to recruit into, across racial and ethnic groupings. Young people these days, don't at 15 say, I'm dreaming to be an HVAC technician, right? And in many instances, because of the kind of restructuring of the economy that's been going on 40 years, they don't have a lot of family they may not, some do, have family members or part of their immediate community that are in the skilled trades. So this is just very unfamiliar to them. So it's very hard to recruit people into these skilled trade occupations, but there are training programs and there is strong demand. And I think our workforce development institutions are doing kind of, B-, they're doing okay in that area. I think they could do more. Then the other, it kind of goes back to the other, when I mentioned that, and it's kind of in, it's in the report in like more detail, but best practice or more kind of, I guess you call it progressive philosophies of workforce development, really are based on this kind of career building path concept. For example, you could have a high school degree and you could take a 30-hour curriculum at Austin Community College and get what's called Environmental Technician 1. That gives you access to which there are a lot of environmental tech jobs. It doesn't pay that, maybe $16, $17 an hour on average. You could enroll then in a 33-hour curriculum and get an associate's degree in environmental management and protection technician. That's a 22-hour job, and an experience of that should provide relatively easy entry into a 4-year bachelor's program in a range of kind of environmental science areas, right? So the idea is, there's a path, there's a career path there. The problem is, which is very structural and very institutional, is making it easy for people to walk that path and move up. And that's where, access to higher ed, which is like deeply problematic, and all these things come up, and these, kind of providing support for individuals who are going down that path, as Miriam emphasized. These are really crucial, and those are the pieces that, in some sense, are missing and really have to be built up and worked on. Yes?
I was fascinated by your mentioning of Tesla So Tesla brings some interesting aspects to this. One, it's mostly an export product, so they'd be creating a lot of cars, but most of those would go nationally. So the environmental effect might be positive for the nation, but might be negative locally. The people working there might be more exposed to chemicals or something else than the people who are driving the cars. The other thing is with jobs at Tesla, there might be, because it is an export export object, there's going to be probably a lot more jobs associated with it besides those at the plant, because there's probably people working at the plant and they're able to afford other services inside the city of Austin, as opposed to providing those services to people who work at export industries. So I was wondering if you considered both of those aspects of the magnifying effect of export jobs and the distributed versus local effect of the greenery.
Well, we did, I mean, that's a good question, tough question. We did, so when we did this kind of, macro level Austin economy, the interesting thing was that of all the jobs, green jobs we estimated for Austin, over 70% of them we estimated through this estimating technique were supported by local demand. So the overall green economy is pretty locally based. It's pretty locally driven, which means city policies make a big difference. But in terms of Tesla, they're producing a product which is substituting for a product which in the lion's share of cases is going to reduce environmental harms, unless your electric grid is totally on a coal power plant or something like that. There's definitely a generalized economic benefit. Will that benefit redound to Austin? I just think looking at this plant and as a local, well, there are other electric car plants all over the U.S. and hopefully more and more Austinites will be driving electric vehicles. And some of those are produced elsewhere. A few of them for the ritzier crowd in Austin will be produced at Tesla. But yeah, I mean, if you just kind of, periscope in on the Tesla plant, there are probably some environmental exposures to Tesla workers. I don't have any real information about that, but I wouldn't be surprised. They'll probably sell some cars in Austin, but most of their cars will be sold elsewhere. And we're importing cars from elsewhere. But overall, the move toward electric vehicles is a positive economic effect.
I'll chime in. Jenny, were you going to say something? And just briefly, I think you bring up a really important point, and climate justice movements are increasingly pushing us to look at environmental injustices along the supply chain. So like the origin of where lithium, for example, or other materials used for vehicles is a very important example of environmental injustices happening globally and not in Austin and well before these cars are made, right? So that's a bigger topic, I think, that is getting more traction and attention. The other thing I'll say is that we want, there are very, very prominent industries in Austin, and I think in urban planning, we often use those as case studies to understand economic industrial growth. But we want to keep coming back to what is holding these industries accountable. Who are the people? What are the entities? Attempting to create some balance in who benefits from their existence. And one of the entities I want to point out that we actually engaged as part of this work is the Climate Justice Project. They're a new entity, but they're collaborating with different unions to try to secure workers' rights. And they were actually in negotiations when that plant was being built. The early stages, my understanding is, and there are newspaper articles on this, that there was a mixed outcome. But that is an example of a history of contestation that I think informs the shape or the direction of workers' rights, workers' conditions in these factories. And certainly exposure is one part, but we also want to keep coming back to what are the many different ways in which people experience large industry, and who are the people trying to generate more equitable outcomes in those conversations. I encourage you all to look up some of that content. I think it's so interesting because we learned so much about Austin in this program, right? And there are a lot of different angles that we can take to better understand what's happening and who's being affected.
I would, last question.
Thank you. I'll give you the last question. So that kind of building on what Miriam was just talking about, I was just thinking about, I worked on a workforce development and evaluation many years ago, and one of the cities that I focused on as part of this research team was Milwaukee, which had very big manufacturing sector, a lot of skilled trades, a heavy union presence, long history of racism in the unions. But it was a boom period. There was really an opportunity. There were people aging out of those trades, so the firms were really willing to partner and rethink and be pushed. And so I'm just trying to think about right now, Austin is growing just, that's what we focus on here is like all the problems that come with growth, but that means we have all these, the demand for skilled trades is incredibly high. We have some unions here, some apprenticeship programs. We have companies that provide these services. Do we have an opportunity to engage with them and really push them? Because I keep thinking in the career ladder stuff, it's true that part of the ladder is at this point you go and get this other certificate and then you can do this. But a big part of the ladder is also the workplace. How does that work? And especially in skilled trades or in unionized offices where you have apprenticeships and other things. This was a lot of what we learned about in Milwaukee was like, how did you get this old white male workforce to accept the new people being brought in? And there were a few cases where companies had really gone, dug into this in a way they never had before because they were motivated to by their own economic interest at that time. So I guess I'm trying to think, is there something analogous now? What are those opportunities? Who could those partners be locally? Could the unions be, I don't know anything about the unions, these unions here in Austin, but who might be those partners? And also part of that partnership would be thinking about outreach on skilled trades. Like Michael was saying, a lot of people just have no contact with those jobs or thinking about that or have an image of it. Well, how do we change that? And could the unions be part of that? Could the employers be part of that? How can we make inroads into these areas that are like just growing dramatically, really well paying, solid career path jobs?
I'm looking at Lawan.
Anybody?
We had to,
It's a rhetorical.
Yeah.
yeah. Right.
Yeah. Yes, there are opportunities, absolutely opportunities. I think, I don't want to speak for Daniel and Mark, but I think we believe, I want to say that the city can also help push in that direction because we are a major purchaser. We have many contracts and many different services that we have to manage for the citizens of Austin, or the residents of Austin. And so, yes, I believe now is the time nationally and locally to have these conversations to change work culture in green industries away from white supremacy culture. Ways in which we're doing this currently is, I've already talked about some of the challenging conversations we've had internal to the city. And I think the other thing we're doing is we've investigated contracts that the city holds with vendors or service providers on city property, vegetation management, other energy generation, to start the conversations to look at, like, what does your culture look like? Do you see a disparity in your workforce? Who are you hiring? Are you collecting racial demographic, gender demographic of who you're hiring and their pay? And then when you get down to honest conversations and you kind of get to establishing trust, that's when we're able to really talk about, well, this is our philosophy. Here is our value system. Here's how we would like to do it. And in order to do it this way, and in order to contract with the city, this must be the way that we do it. And so, but that being said, we're not coming up with this in isolation, right? There are workforce providers that are also we're learning from. And so, yes, you're absolutely right. Part of the challenge with the idea of a quality job is just because you get paid more doesn't mean it's a quality job. I think, the Tesla question is an interesting one in the fact that what makes a job just? That's the question, right? And we're all gonna have different opinions about that. If the job pays you millions of dollars, but it puts you in front of cancerous material and you're only gonna live a certain amount, is that just? I would argue not. So I think the city needs to hold itself accountable first to its own programs, and at the same time have conversations that really shift the internal culture of a lot of these organizations that we are spending lots of money to contract with. So I think that's the real opportunity from the city's perspective, and I think that has cascading repercussions regionally. An example of that is our workforce contract with American Youth Works. They were initially using AmeriCorps members, and I was an AmeriCorps member in full transparency, who did a lot of this work for $8. I think if you spread it out through their entire term, it's $7, $8 for an AmeriCorps member versus $15 to do brutally difficult labor that needs to be done. But also, one of the ways I think the city led with ACCC is by rejecting that low wage and saying, you can do it this way, but that's not the way we're going to do it. We're going to fund the additional money and request that you pay them $15 an hour and look at the projects to see what we're exposing folks to. So yes, I think now is the time to match workforce, climate, and justice. And I think the city is a major player in modeling how this can be done regionally and being very critical of itself and the work cultures in which we support through contracts.
Just to briefly add, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't acknowledge how public sentiment toward unions is changing, right? Apparently, the public support for unions is the highest it's been since 1965. So we're seeing a shift. And one important date, any Beyonce fans? Okay, You Won't Break My Soul, right? It's making its way into pop culture even, and I think that's something that's pretty exciting, and thinking about what's going on nationally and how it might inform local efforts as well.
Great, thanks everyone. Let's give a hand. Thank you.